Understand what happened in December 1971, you have to understand what Pakistan believed it had built. East Pakistan was 1,000 miles from West Pakistan, separated by hostile Indian territory. It was 55,000 square miles of rivers, monsoon-flooded rice paddies, and dense delta terrain that funneled any invader into narrow choke points. Every major town, Jessore, Jamalpur, Kamilla, Sylhet, had been turned into a fortress. Bunkers, minefields, and interlocking fields of fire. Niazi had roughly 45,000 regular army troops in the Eastern Command, backed by paramilitary, police, and Razakar militias, a total combat strength that would swell to over 90,000 when the surrender was counted. The Pakistani plan was elegant on paper: hold the fortress towns, bleed the Indian army in urban combat. Wait for the United Nations to impose a ceasefire, or wait for the 7th Fleet from the United States to force India to the table. Yahya Khan had assurances from Washington. He had assurances from Beijing. He believed he had time. He did not have time. Across the border, India's Chief of Army Staff, Field Marshal Sam Mankshaw, had been preparing for this war since April. When Indira Gandhi ordered him to attack immediately in the spring of 1971, he refused, publicly. He told her the monsoon would drown his tanks, the Himalayan passes were still open for a Chinese intervention, and his armored brigades were not yet re-equipped. He asked for 8 months. He got them. That refusal, a general telling a prime minister no, is arguably the single most important decision of the entire war. But we will get to the moment that shocked even the Pakistani commanders. Stay with me. Mankshaw's Eastern Command was handed to Lieutenant General Jagjit Singh Arora. His chief of staff was Major General J.F.R. Jacob, a soldier who had studied every failed river crossing in modern military history and reached a heretical conclusion. The fortress towns were a trap, not for the attackers, for the defenders. Here is what the history books often leave out. Jacob's plan for the invasion of East Pakistan was rejected repeatedly by army headquarters in Delhi. The official doctrine said you take the towns, you reduce the fortresses, you clear the ground methodically. Jacob wanted to do the opposite. His plan, refined through the summer of 1971, was built on a single insight. The Pakistani army in East Pakistan was road-bound and town-bound. If Indian forces bypassed the fortresses entirely, leaving them isolated behind the advancing line, they would become strategically useless. The prize was Dhaka, not Jessore, not Kamilla, not Chittagong. Dhaka. Capture the capital and every fortress became a garrison guarding nothing. Delhi called it reckless. Jacob was leaving fortified enemy positions in his rear with unbroken supply lines near his logistics tail. Every staff college in the world would have failed the plan. Jacob pushed anyway. Arora backed him. Mankshaw signed off. If it worked, the war would end in weeks. If it failed, an entire Indian corps would be encircled by the very forces they had bypassed. If this is landing, save this video. You will want to come back to this one. The war formally began on December 3, 1971, when the Pakistan Air Force launched preemptive strikes on 11 Indian airfields. Operation Chengiz Khan. Modeled on Israel's 6-day war opening, it was a catastrophic failure. Only 2 Indian aircraft were destroyed. Within 48 hours, the Indian Air Force had crippled the PAF in the east. By December 6, Indian pilots owned the sky over Dhaka. Then came the Bluff. 3 Indian corps rolled across the border on multiple axes. II Corps from the west under Lieutenant General T.N. Raina, XXXII Corps from the northwest under Lieutenant General M.L. Thapan, and IV Corps from the east under Lieutenant General Sagat Singh. Every Pakistani commander expected the classic attritional advance. Assault the fortress, reduce it, move on. Instead, Indian columns simply drove around them. When a strongpoint at Akora resisted, Sagat Singh went around it. When Jessore's garrison prepared for a siege, Indian armor was already 60 kilometers past them, heading east. The most spectacular maneuver came from Sagat Singh, a cavalryman with no formal training in airborne operations. He commandeered the entire Indian Air Force helicopter fleet in the east and began leapfrogging his infantry across the Meghna River, one of the widest waterways in Asia. The Meghna was supposed to be Pakistan's final defensive line. Niazi had assumed no army could cross it without months of preparation and heavy bridging equipment. Sagat Singh crossed it in helicopters, at night, without air cover, ferrying an entire brigade over water in a lift that military engineers still study today. By December 11, Indian units were within striking distance of Dhaka. Niazi's fortress strategy had already collapsed, not because the fortresses fell, but because the war had gone past them. On December 14, an intercepted radio message told Indian intelligence that a senior meeting of Pakistani civilian officials and military governors was being held at Government House in Dhaka. 4 MiG-21s from No. 28 Squadron were vectored in. They put rockets through the roof. The governor of East Pakistan, Dr. A.M. Malik, resigned on paper that was still wet, literally wrote his resignation with a shaking hand, and fled to a neutral zone at the Hotel Intercontinental. The political structure of East Pakistan disintegrated in a single afternoon. But Niazi still had troops. He still had ammunition. Dhaka itself was defended by roughly 26,400 combat troops with prepared positions. A determined defense of the capital could have cost the Indian Army thousands of lives and dragged the war into January, long enough for the American 7th Fleet, already steaming into the Bay of Bengal, to force a ceasefire that would have preserved Pakistani East. The Task Force 74, led by the USS Enterprise, was 72 hours away. Everyone in Islamabad knew it. Everyone in Delhi knew it. This is where the Bluff became legend. On December 15, Major General J.F.R. Jacob was ordered by Mankshaw to fly into Dhaka and negotiate a surrender. Jacob had roughly 3,000 Indian troops within reach of the city, a fraction of Niazi's garrison. His formal instructions were vague. His actual mission, as he later described it, was to make Niazi surrender before anyone counted the forces on either side. Jacob landed at Dhaka airfield with a small escort and was driven to Niazi's headquarters. He carried a draft instrument of surrender that he had typed himself on the flight in. Niazi read it. He objected. He said this was a ceasefire agreement, not a surrender. He said his men would fight in the streets. Jacob walked out onto the veranda alone, looked at his watch, and gave Niazi 30 minutes. There were no 30 minutes worth of Indian reinforcements. There was no encirclement of Dhaka. The city was defended by more Pakistani soldiers than Jacob had in his entire spearhead. If Niazi had said no, if he had made one phone call to any of his brigade commanders, Jacob would have been captured or killed, and the war might have lasted another month. Niazi said yes. At 16:31 local time on December 16, 1971, at the Ramna race course in Dhaka, Lieutenant General A.A.K. Niazi signed the instrument of surrender across from Lieutenant General Jagjit Singh Arora. 93,000 Pakistani military and paramilitary personnel became prisoners of war, the largest military surrender since the fall of Nazi Germany. The ground war had lasted 13 days. The decisive collapse from the Meghna crossing to the surrender table took 9. The consequences arrived immediately, and they never stopped arriving. East Pakistan ceased to exist. Bangladesh, a nation of 75 million people, was born on the ashes of Niazi's headquarters. Pakistan, the country that had gone to war believing it was defending national unity, lost 56% of its population and a third of its economy in less than 2 weeks. Yahya Khan resigned 4 days after the surrender. He would spend most of the rest of his life under house arrest. For the Indian military, the campaign became a case study taught at Sandhurst, Fort Leavenworth, and every staff college in the developing world. It was the first successful large-scale application of what would later be called maneuver warfare in a South Asian context, the deliberate bypassing of fortified positions in favor of speed, psychological pressure, and the seizure of decisive terrain. Jacob's methodology: refuse to be drawn into the enemy's preferred fight, dislocate rather than destroy, take the political center of gravity, became doctrine in half a dozen armies. But there is a darker legacy that historians still argue about. Niazi did not have to surrender on December 16. His forces in Dhaka were largely intact. He had food, ammunition, water, and prepared defenses. The 7th Fleet was hours from Bengal. A prolonged defense of the capital, however brutal, could have changed the terms of the settlement, saved Pakistani prisoners from years in Indian camps, and possibly kept a rump East Pakistan alive in some form. Why did he sign? Some Pakistani historians argue Niazi was outmaneuvered psychologically, that Jacob's bluff simply worked. Others argue he had lost the will to command after the collapse of civil government, and the atrocities his own units had committed during the spring crackdown, Operation Searchlight, when the Pakistan Army killed hundreds of thousands of Bengali civilians. Still others argue he was, quite simply, a competent officer who understood that fighting on meant civilian slaughter in Dhaka and knew he had already lost. The debate is unresolved 50-plus years later. What is not debated is the strategic verdict. In 9 decisive days, one general's plan, rejected by his own headquarters, dismantled an army twice the size of his spearhead and redrew the map of South Asia. It is one of the cleanest examples in modern military history of a war being won by an idea before it was won by a soldier. CTA 1213 Min. If you find yourself thinking about the wars that get overlooked, the campaigns that reshaped continents but never made it into the movies, subscribe and hit the bell icon. New battle every Wednesday. 1971 is one of the largest untold stories in modern warfare. and this channel is going deep on the operations, the commanders, and the decisions that history books usually skip. Drop in the comments, was Niazi's surrender an act of cowardice or the most humane decision available to him? I want to hear which side you land on. Outro 1315 Min. Every great campaign leaves behind one lesson. The lesson of December 1971 is that fortresses are only strong if the war stays where the fortresses are. Niazi built the wrong war. Jacob refused to fight it. 93,000 men paid the price for a plan that never adapted against an enemy who was willing to bet everything on speed and nerve. The Ramna race course still exists in Dhaka. On the anniversary every December 16, Bangladeshi veterans and Indian officers meet there, old men now, standing on the ground where a subcontinent was rewritten in one afternoon. If this one hit, my next deep dive on the 1965 Battle of Chawinda, the largest tank engagement since Kursk, and the one nobody talks about, will blow your mind. Watch that next. On December 16, 1971, Lieutenant General A.A.K. Niazi signed the largest military surrender since the fall of Nazi Germany. 93,000 Pakistani soldiers became prisoners of war in a campaign that lasted just 13 days, with the decisive collapse happening in only 9. This is the untold story of how Major General J.F.R. Jacobs' rejected battle plan, Field Marshal Sam Menkshaw's refusal to attack too early, and Lieutenant General Sagat Singh's improvised helicopter crossing of the Meghna River dismantled an entire Pakistani corps and gave birth to Bangladesh. Featuring the full order of battle, the strategic calculations of both commands, the role of the American 7th Fleet, and the psychological bluff at Dhaka that ended the war. Timestamps 0000, the largest surrender since WWII 00. 35, the impossible fortress, East Pakistan 1971 03. 00, the plan nobody wanted. Jacob's heresy 06. 00, the note that ended a war. Dhaka December 16 09. 00, the doctrine that rewrote a continent 12. 00, subscribe for weekly military history 13. 00, the legacy of Ramna race course commanders featured. Field Marshal Sam Menkshaw, LT. Gen Jagjit Singh Aurora Maj. Gen JFR Jacob, LT. Gen Sagat Singh, LT. Gen AAK Niazi, President Yahya Khan. New military history every Wednesday. Subscribe and hit the bell.